Very good. No, I loved it, but I don't. What's the name of that piece?
It's called Trumpet Voluntary. Some of you may have heard that before. It's often played at weddings. It's by I think there's some debate whether it's by Henry Purcell or Jeremiah Clark, classical composers. I think Jeremiah Clark is the one who's usually now credited with that piece. But yeah, as I said, it's often played at weddings and processional events. I think it was one of the royal weddings I heard it played. And the reason that I'm playing that is just to underscore what tyranny we're living under, how we've been forbidden to gather together for weddings and funerals. I mean, I could have played a more funereal type of piece, too, to make that point. I chose not to. But this is really a violation of all of our basic human rights. I mean, the most tyrannical leaders in history generally allowed people to gather for weddings and funerals. So what we're living under now, they're not even treating us as people. We're like just cattle to them. We're just being stripped of all of our human dignity, and I don't think that we should be tolerating this. So that's okay.
Anyway, this is kind of a continuation too. We're going to try to get really into the conversation about the book, because last week we recorded it, and then I went to retrieve it from the tablet I recorded on, because we record on a Switcher Studio, and I put it on the tablet, and it just like a catastrophic failure. It really was catastrophic. So we had the first half up. This is called part two of the conversation, part two of the last week's show. But we'll continue to just roll it in, do a full hour on this, because, different riffing on talk about the book and also our observations like you just got done doing. By the way, I'd like to bring up the point, too, that this country is supposed to be the land of the free. In the 1920s, they had prohibition going on, right? Mm-hmm. 1900, 1929, I think they repealed it. Went on for like 10, 11 years. No country in the world, to my knowledge, except for the Islamic Republic, forbade the use of alcohol, because even the kings, when they realize, hey, when I'm beating up the peasants, at least they have their solace of, fermented stuff they can forget their troubles with. Mainly, I'm the trouble, but I want them to have that so they can at least kind of not turn on me against so much. So even we're the land of the free, actually told people they couldn't drink back in the 1920s. Think about that. So, I mean, we're not of that free. And that's my point. I mean, we waved the flag on the 4th of July. We set off fireworks. But if you look at the erosion of our freedoms, it's been sped up greatly by this. They've been using this as the excuse to take away more freedoms. And that's indisputable.
Right. And what I hear is that Donald Trump wasn't really supposed to be president, that they've been rigging elections for a long time. And I guess Trump and the people he's working with, he wasn't just working alone as a lone agent. He was actually recruited to run for president by people who have patriotic elements within our government, our military, our intelligence agencies, and they knew about the deep state's policy of rigging elections, and and they did rig the election that he won in it, but they didn't rig it enough because, just too many people voted for him. So whatever they did wasn't sufficient. So then in this last election, they made up for that. But anyway, the point is that he wasn't real. They didn't plan on him winning. They thought that whatever rigging they had done, was adequate, but it wasn't. And so the fact that he won, and he enacted policies during his 4 years that put back their agenda. So their agenda is really anti-human, and for a one world government that they can control. And the fact that they lost those 4 years where he was putting in all kinds of policies that they didn't like, that means that they had to speed up their plans. So now they're moving much faster than they would have ordinarily. Like often, our government does things that are tyrannical, but they do it in such a gradual way that we don't notice it. So the people who maybe speak out and say, "Hey, this goes against all our freedom and our rights," they look like kind of nut jobs, real conspiracy theorists, because whatever the government's doing looks very moderate and measured, and why are they complaining? But now they're having to really rush their agenda, and it looks very tyrannical. And I mean, not everyone sees through it. A lot of people are happy to go along with it, but I think a whole lot more people are now suddenly aware, myself included, of what's going on than would have been if they had gone about it in a much more, much slower way. That's not my own observation. I listen to X22 report a lot. That's they have. It's a website, x22report.com, but the website, the guy named Dave, I don't know his last name, he goes by Dave, but he puts out a lot of videos that explain, what I think is going on. So.
Well, another thing is too, it's like the Democrats are now trying to pack the Supreme Court, try to get more Supreme Court justices, which means they're going to be able to push through even more of an agenda, unopposed, on a constitutional basis at least, because they're going to be on board with the further erosion of the constitutional guarantees. They look as an impediment, nothing a serious impediment at that. This is like this goes back to the FDR era. He did repeal the prohibition, but I basically think that he knew his predecessors has gone too far with the pushing of their agenda. So he would get back drink to people, so he knew that they'd at least have some solace for the other stuff he's trying to push, primarily. And the thing is, his economic reforms were a failure. The only thing what caused an economic turnaround in this country was World War II, and look what we had the price to pay for that. I mean, the bulk of our population of men at that time had to go to war. Many of them never coming back. Many of them coming back totally altered in a horrific sense, physically and emotionally because of it. That's what thing is. My friend that says the socialists, the communists, see humans as a log to throw into a fire. They'll warm themselves with it, and they'll get other people to gather around and enjoy that heat for a while. But basically, look at the cost, and they don't be damned about that. They don't care. The socialists don't care, and it's gonna. We talked about that before. I know that your family typically identified with being more on the left, and you've gone back and forth on your allegiance and your support. But if you were to put it to family members who are more still identifiably on the left, how do you think they would? Maybe it's an unfair question because you don't want to actually give conjecture. But how do you think they would actually offer a defense of what's going on now?
Well, my mother was on the left, but she often didn't consider herself a Democrat. I mean, maybe she would consider herself farther to the left. I'm not sure if she was actually farther to the left or maybe not far enough to the left, because she was more, I think John and I have talked about this, sort of more libertarian mind. She was very much an individualist. So, her sentiments were generally characterized by being on the left, but I think she was more generally a populist and an individualist. And I think I used to know more people on the left who seemed individualistic, but nowadays it seems like that's not one of the left values. So if my mom passed away a few years ago, I'm not really sure exactly where she would weigh in. So, I mean, maybe that's one of the reasons that it wasn't maybe that was one of the reasons why God saw fit to, take her when he did. I mean, I guess we all have our different views of theology and things, but, maybe, I mean, I think she continues to, be involved from the other side in some way, but, in this current situation, I don't think that she would have really been on board with either camp, because I don't see her ever becoming, aligning herself with the conservatives, but I certainly don't see herself aligning herself with the very thuggish, mob-like mentality of the left, where everyone has to be very doctrinaire. She always had a problem with doctrinaire people on the left as well as on the right. I mean, she had to be herself and do her own thing, and it seems like today's left is very conformist. You absolutely have to conform to their ideology, and I have other relatives. One of my relatives, I guess, still considers himself a Democrat, but maybe more of a libertarian, populist-leaning Democrat. So he's not really on board with everything that's going on right now. But then I have other relatives who are absolutely on board with what's going on right now, who are very much conformist leftists, and it's very disappointing, because those people who are going along with it, as John and I have talked about before, these are people who are sort of very intellectual, intelligentsia, academic types that, before this experience, I would have had higher expectations of. I guess I would have thought that the intellectuals are the ones who would see through tyranny and corruption, and they would be the shining lights to guide us all, but that's actually kind of the opposite of what I'm seeing. And, I'm realizing that was maybe an elitist view that I had, that the intelligentsia were somehow better than everyone else, but they're actually often kind of worse than everyone else when it comes to recognizing tyranny. John and I were talking beforehand about the Maoist Revolution, how that was a case where the communists kind of targeted the intellectuals and the academics and I guess they call them the bourgeoisie. I don't know what the Chinese word for that was, but when you read translations, it's the bourgeoisie that were targeted, meaning the intellectuals. But it seems like today it's the intellectuals who are very much on board with the tyranny that we're seeing. And, it's kind of a contrast, I would say.
Because typically you see the left well represented, overrepresented on the college campuses. Mm-hmm. And the reason why that is basically they're so satisfied with their lives, maybe just be putting in less sinister terms. They're so satisfied with their lives. They get to travel, they have respect, they have adoration of the public, they get to publish papers every so often. It puts them up higher in the esteem of their peers wherever they're at. So they think, well, this it's a socialist system within the college campus. It's it's backed by government dollars, taxpayers' funds, because that's all it comes from is taxpayers on the federal level, state level, and local level. So they receive funding from all sources, also from corporations on the larger scale campuses such as U of M Ann Arbor. They receive millions and billions of dollars for research, because let's face it, they got people who know how to do research. They can the corporations, the think tanks, all can benefit from the information they gather through their research, be it actual like test tubes and testing kind of stuff, or social research. So everybody enjoys this great gravy train. So sometimes maybe they simply think that they're going to try to enlarge the scope and the reach of that, possibly, and maybe they're done for trying to do it for benevolent reasons. But the ultimate factor is they don't like people challenging their assertions, which is actually not being scientific, because the scientific community, as soon as a paper is published and read or made public, there's challenges to it. They want the abstract. They want to see how the information was gathered, how the evidence or the support was gathered and gained. What kind of techniques or which methodologies they employed. And then they go around and try to readjust it, do on different methods, see if they can get the same results.
Well, ideally that's true. I'm not sure if it actually is true all the time, but that's the scientific method.
Well, it's like, let's face it, when you're a researcher, though, you want to get the money to justify your existence. So you're going to go out there and challenge any research, even if you might find it merit. You want to challenge it because you want that money coming in for yourself.
But if it's a popular theory, then other scientists might try to get on board with it and not challenge it.
That's true, too. But the thing is, I think a large portion of this right now is it's undeniable that the sciences and scientific methodologies are very biased because they're done by humans. They could possibly be very biased. And to think that can't be or shouldn't be a concern is ridiculous. I've seen this on college campuses. I had a professor one time, and he was an English professor, taught English as literature. And he said he's seen camps develop around how a paper was read, at a symposium or at a conference. And he's seen camps develop around that on stuff that actually has no real big payoff on a larger scope, on a larger scale. And they've seen camps develop around that. So, I mean, academia is actually, you have people who have a zeal for something, some kind of arcane field. Maybe it's ridiculously arcane. Stuff like, you still people getting funding for being professors of Sanskrit. The Indian people themselves don't even use that language, okay?
Some of our words are derived from it. So.
Right. The Latin, the reason why we use Latin in medical field is because it's a dead language. Let's face it, the word sick nowadays, I mean, in certain parlance, it means like bad or cool or great. I would never use that word in that sense, but some people do. It's the reason why Latin was chosen, because there is not such a flexibility. It's not brought in too much into colloquial speech, so it doesn't have this transitory ability. Or resistant at least.
That was the reason. That's interesting.
Latin, that's why it's used in the medical field as well as the legal field, and in certain parlances also amongst the Roman Catholics, because that was the language of the people of the time of the church's development. It was Latin and Greek to some degree. I always thought that was weird too, because Greek was actually used by the Roman-speaking world, the Latin-speaking world, because it was considered like superior, and then later on there was a transition where they use their own language. They become more colloquial,
Okay.
And that's why you see that too. German resisted Latinization even in the fields of medical research or scientific endeavors. They actually compounded words, created words out of their own language. Now, there could be somebody else, a scholar, listening to me in that, a linguist. I could be wrong, but that's what was explained to me by a scholar who was a linguist. So that's what
John
explained
knows
to me.
all kinds of information about every topic you can name, probably.
That's one benefit of being in a college campus. That's the benefit of it, because you're around a college campus. I'm not saying that everything they do is totally. Let's face it, very little what I studied. I'll give you ample ammunition, people. There's stuff I studied is absolutely inane, okay? I've studied stuff like philosophy. Most people would dismiss that as basically splitting hairs too much. Theology is the same way. That's what it is. And I have an interest in all those things.
So speaking of scholarship,
go on.
We're going to get into our book that was we've been discussing this book, Architects of the Culture of Death.
Right.
And John can give us the authors, because I still can't remember their names.
Okay.
Or the editors, that is.
Hold on, I'll grab my book right there.
Okay. But every week we've been discussing a chapter of that in the book. Every chapter is someone that these editors and authors feel contributed to our current, what they see as a culture of death. And other people have used that term also. And this week we were focusing on Alan Guttmacher. I hope I pronounced that right.
Yeah, he was a person I didn't know much about before reading this chapter in this book. And by the way, the name of the two compilers, editors, is Donald DeMarco and Benjamin Weicker.
Okay, thank you.
And I think I've seen Benjamin Weicker on EWTN shows.
Oh, really? Okay,
yeah,
that's a good.
I've seen him before
station.
there. And also a person. This is from Ignatius Press, I think it is, which is a Catholic press. The editors, compilers are actually very decidedly Roman Catholic and very. We're not talking about very secularized. The book came out and first printing was in 2004, so it's been around for a while. But I think they would do a fair job of bringing together a lot of philosophers, a lot of thinkers, a lot of social science people, sociological figures that or in the field of sociology that actually contribute to what we see as a decay. They see as a decay in Western civilization primarily, and the irony of it is, you have people who see that most of these people throughout the common thread for all these thinkers would be considered in a broad scale be humanist. Mm-hmm. And humanism itself's got its roots in Christianity, because it basically valued the individual as a human creation, a creator of God. Erasmus the not Erasmus Darwin, who was the grandfather of Charles Darwin, but Erasmus, the churchman, who actually, I think he came about with the term humanism, was usually associated with him, was definitely a very decided Christian. I mean, very definitely a Christian. So humanism, and I think it's a large portion of that because you're of the Jewish faith, Judaism is your religion anyway. There's actually a carryover from that into Christianity in that respect for the individual.
Yeah, and you used to hear a lot. I don't think it's a popular term these days, but a while ago you'd hear a lot about secular humanism, and it's just sort of ironic because secular humanism, which I guess a lot of people who weren't very religious might say that they were secular humanists. It seems like it's kind of devolved into something that isn't humanist, that's kind of anti-human, or promoting abortion on a wide scale, and euthanasia, and things that are saying that the world is overpopulated. I would say that those are actually anti-human things, but nonetheless, those are ideas that were typically embraced by the people calling themselves secular humanists. I mean, I guess now those same ideas are being pushed by the modern left, but they might have new terms for whatever they are. I guess woke is the most recent incarnation, but it's basically an evolution of the same thing. So,
well, see, I just read an interesting selection from a selection of daily readings from St. John Chrysostom, who was a big figure both in both churches, East and West, but primarily in the Orthodox East. And he said something about, if you read the narrative in Genesis about what was created first, the world is created. Basically, he made it akin to a palace, and the palace is created for the king to be able to dwell within it. And he sees humankind, as being the royalty that's going to inhabit the kingdom of the earth. And the thing is, some people say that stripped of the religious meaning, you can just say we're just another animal on this planet. Mm-hmm. But in the religious sense, well, I was raised in a church, and we're always taught about stewardship. And when the environmental measure started in the 70s, cleaning up parks and all that other stuff locally and stuff like that, we're always seeing that as an opportunity to show good stewardship. And also be concerned about the environmental hazards such as waste being dumped into the water is bad stewardship, and that was considered sinful. But it wasn't because we had this love for creation itself. We had appreciation for the Creator, and we were in our place in the creation that He made for us. See, whereas the secular humanist, who was an environmentalist, sees us as nothing more than an impediment to the enjoyment of other species enjoying the planet.
Right, and actually that's a good lead into one of my points about Guttmacher, is that who he was, first of all. He was, there's the Alan Guttmacher Institute, which is the research arm for Planned Parenthood. And he was, best known, and again, I hadn't heard of him before, but what I learned from the chapter, he was a big promoter of birth control on a wide scale. But he was a doctor. But one of the things he talked about in his advocating of use of birth control was primate behavior. And I guess, people are technically primates, but it just seemed to me kind of strange that he would make a big deal about how primates supposedly, what their sexual practices are, as a way of justifying how people should be. Because I think, even though we're technically primates, there's a difference between us and a chimpanzee or a gorilla. And, we should have somewhat higher standards for ourselves in terms of, morals and, what we can control. And I think we need to see ourselves as being somewhat different from other animals. As John said, we're responsible for being good stewards of the planet. But I don't think we should see ourselves as just another animal, we're capable of having moral standards, and holding ourselves to that, and, having self-discipline, and just seeing ourselves as just one more species, and no different from any other primate, I think that's very dangerous.
That's a good point. That's a point that's going to be driven home, I think, more, is to, when you tell people, well, humans are just another type of animal. There's undeniable, because we're carbon-based life forms living on the Terra, Earth. We drink water. We have to have certain nutrients to exist. We're mammals. We give birth to living young. The female of the species, and I guess this is still indisputable, produces milk during the time of the child's infancy to nurse it. So we're mammalian in that respect. We also have of course, before you get to that stage, we have a vertebra, and we also have a spinal cord, and the involved process at the end of that spinal cord is the brain. So we're basically, could be taxonomically, we are animals. But I think there's a great disservice of the planet if you just want to put us, and we want to embrace that animal label. Because much of what humans are, from my readings of philosophy and history, and the philosophy of history, philosophy of science, is that what makes us unique so much, some people would say to the basic, we possess opposable thumbs so we can make tools, and that's what. But actually,
Yeah, I'm not sold on that, because my birds have opposable thumbs, and I mean, they're smart. I'm not knocking my birds, but they're different from people.
But that's what's different from people, because what I think what's unique about humans is something who can't be considered as tangible, but actually is, because you can't point to it, but as a value necessarily. But I don't think I can try and anticipate people's arguments in my head, but what about the point I'm trying to make is we're valuing animals. We assign value. And that's what makes us unique. Animals have some kind of language. They understand each other. A bird tweeting will understand another bird tweeting of the same species primarily, and sends an alarm throughout the flock to move on, to get out of there, whatever. So they can pick up on these kind of nonverbal and very verbal communications to actually change their behavior or assist each other, whatever. So I can't say we even have the right of language, the tongue that we have, which probably could do more damage than the other species, by the way. But the tongue is like not where we're the difference at. The uniqueness about humans is we can look at things and evaluate. We can have this Nietzschean kind of concept of we actually create our own table of values that we're going to live under and ultimately die under. So I think that's where it makes us unique as animals, but better than the other animals. I'd say even better than
Okay. Yeah. Well, we recorded something about this last week, and with all the censorship that's going on, it didn't, make it. So we're sort of recreating some of our conversations. So, the censorship these days. This is another part of the tyranny. But as I mentioned last week in the show that I think didn't get aired. You just said that people are in some ways better than other animals, but one of the things about Guttmacher is he actually made the case, at least to my mind, that people are worse than other animals, because he made this claim, which I don't believe is true, at least I've never heard this true, that in animals, the female of the species consenting is necessary for procreation to occur. But with people, a rape, violent rape can result in procreation. So that's one way that we're different from other animals. And I think to most people's mind that would mean that we're actually worse than other animals. But I think in the natural world, other animals, I think a male animal can force himself on the female and result in procreation, result in the animals having offspring. And so I don't think that people are unique in that way. But it just seemed like that's a way that he, not only is Guttmacher saying that people are no better than other animals, but he's even implying that we're worse than other animals. So that just seemed kind of strange to me. So.
Well, the thing is, I remember reading, it's interesting I missed that point you made, because you made the similar point last week. But when I didn't pick up on it, because I've read research amongst the related species of chimp, or related to the chimps, the bonobos or bonobos or whatever they're called, and they actually say that the researchers say that they actually have found indication that though that species actually engage in sex just for pleasure, much like humans.
Yeah, I've heard that.
And there is rapes going on within that, and actually there's I guess we could say in human terms, heterosexual rape as long as homosexual rape. It occurs in certain animal species primarily amongst the primates. So, I mean, his assertion on that is as a hold water. Now, say in a heterosexual pairing of a male and a female, bonobo or whatever I can't remember how to pronounce the name.
I think that's right, bonobo,
But
from what I've heard anyway.
But anyway, I don't know if they'd result in a pregnancy, but I don't see where it would be ruled out either, So his assertion on that. Another thing is he did try to step up and try to say that soften his position about us being animalistic at one point, but actually backfired about promiscuity, I think about. And
Right. Yeah, and he sort of talked out of both sides of his mouth with promiscuity, because on the one hand he would preach against it, against the, sex before marriage and things, but then on the other hand he would justify it. So the fact that he sometimes preached against it made him appear like he was more conservative and more on the side of traditional morality, so that a lot of people were willing to listen to him and invite him onto campuses and into more respectable venues, because he seemed like a very moderate, respectable, conservative type of guy. But then what he was actually preaching wasn't so conservative. He was actually saying that promiscuity was the natural state of people, and he himself was actually a kind of promiscuous guy. And it seemed from this chapter that we read anyway that a lot of his advocacy of birth control and just the idea that people should be allowed to have sex just for pleasure, basically whenever they wanted, and just holding us to a very low moral standard, that was his main message, but that the fact that he didn't always talk like that made him, got him invited to places where he could spread his more I guess, hedonistic message, even though, so he was kind of deceptive that way. He had sort of two faces, and that was how he managed to present his method or his message. And it seems like that's kind of what I'm seeing a lot these days on a national scale. It seems like, well, with politicians and celebrities and the people that we hold up as the pillars of society, they often present themselves one way, but actually what they're doing, what they're imposing on our society is something very different. Like they don't present themselves as communists, which is essentially, as John and I were talking about before the show, what they are. They're trying to take our country in a very communistic direction, but they don't present themselves as radical Marxists, revolutionary types. I think Glenn Beck used to talk about this on his show. Maybe he still does, I don't know, but how there was some, unfortunately I don't remember the philosopher that he cited as the one who maybe it was Saul Alinsky, but I'm not sure, it might have been a different leftist, who advocated, not appearing to be a very radical, revolutionary Marxist type, becoming more respectable, trying to institute yourself in the universities and other, academic institutions and become part of the power structure. And then once you're in that power structure, then you can enact your very revolutionary, radical ideas. So.
Well, there's 2 points that I'd like to bring up too, like the Renaissance era philosopher Niccolo Machiavelli. Mm-hmm. He wrote that book, the discourse called the Prince, right. And then he was instructing the prince of how to gain political power. And he said, It's not. At one point, he said, it's not necessary for the prince to be pious. He only has to appear as pious. So basically, whatever the god basically is of that culture at that time, you pretend like you're the server of it. You're the almost adamant defender of it, and then you gain power. And another thing is too, to go to a joke that was on the old TV series MASH. Somebody said about escargot. He said, what's that? He goes, snails. He goes, who'd eat snails? He goes, they won't. That's why they call it escargot. Basically, so the fancy name of it basically hides the fact, conceals the fact that it's snails. So I mean, that's what it is. So nobody can call it communism because let's face it, even the most brain dead person on the planet has heard about the oppressiveness of the communist regime in China, the repressive regime in Russia, Romania, Yugoslavia, wherever it happened at, the brutality, the murder, the people disappearing overnight. So you couldn't sell it. saying, we're going to bring murder and mayhem because we're going to bring you communism. No, this is like the reset.
And the Nazis, of course, were the National Socialist Party.
Right.
Say, oh no, that wasn't really social. No, yeah, that was socialism.
It was like with 12 planks. And actually, Bernard Goldberg wrote the book Liberal Fascism. I think it was Bernard Goldberg.
Right, yes, that was a very good book.
Good book. Oh, you did read it then?
Yes.
Okay, he says, see, socialism, the only difference between German version of it and the one that the Marxist, actually, the communist of, the middle of Russia would have, is that it was unique to nationalism, that nation tied into the fervor and the ideas of racial superiority and stuff that the Germans were developing at that time. They didn't really possess it until Hitler stirred the pot, and the Nazis did that. But let's face it, Karl Marx and his followers were not any less racist than anybody else at that time. That was that milieu of history, basically people, us against them, they're different, and our differences are what makes them different, and there's no interchangeability. There's a significant difference. And they also misapplied scientific principles to justify that brutality or that change of behavior.
Yeah, and thanks for bringing up racism because, well, I mean, it's the news everywhere these days, but one of the things that we're hearing about a lot lately is critical race theory, and that was also mentioned in that book, Liberal Fascism. That's where I first heard of it. But I was sort of under the impression from that book, I don't know if he actually said it or not, but I sort of thought that was maybe, I didn't realize that people actually use that term. I thought that was maybe their underlying philosophy, but I didn't realize that they proudly said that, this is critical race theory that we're doing. But apparently nowadays it is anyway. That's what they're trying to put in place in schools, and some of the training that they're imposing on corporations, requiring them to get in-service training and stuff. But critical race theory is this guiding principle they're trying to impose everywhere, and it's basically pitting races against each other. I mean, people often don't see it as racist because it's supposedly taking the side of the oppressed, the races that have traditionally, the minority populations, and maybe, making the white people the villains, the bad guys, and these other races are, these poor downtrodden races. But it basically is racist because it's vilifying all members of one race. But it also, for all the talk about hate crimes against Asians, it ends up being anti-Asian also. And apparently there was recently a bill before Congress to outlaw discrimination against Asians, and I think it was in colleges, but some measure that was specifically against discrimination against Asians. And the Democrats all voted against it because in colleges they like to discriminate against Asians because Asians tend to do better on the admittance exams.
Yep. It's a form of racism itself. I remember a local ruling over 20-some years ago. Some judge in this local area said that Hispanics and Asians weren't considered minorities under what his reading of the Civil Rights Acts were. So basically, it is turning. I don't know if there could be anything could be totally unbiased. The only thing is, my friends and I used to kick this around when we were talking, in college, and the only thing that we can better guarantee is for people when they're being evaluated only by their abilities is basically to take one person and have them take out and block out the name of the individual and assign that individual name and record it to the name, and then pass out the information that will be relative to the evaluation of this person being a candidate, and just have a number to deal with, not a name.
Yeah,
and
that sounds good.
And that's like a good idea. It may be a good approach to start. And guess what? If you're just looking at their shared capabilities or the abilities or their the past achievements and where they're, nobody can guess where they can go with it. That's up to the individual and circumstances and that time. But that'd be less punitive, less racist, just to go by a number and saying, so number 26 and number 24 are the top leaders in this being accepted in this program because they got this, they have done that. They scored this, and that's it. You just look at the numbers, and you look at the numbers and look at their achievements.
Yeah, and again, these people who are using racism, they're well, for one thing, the reason it's called critical race theory, as I learned from the book, is the operative word is critical. And what they do is they just criticize, I think they said in the book something like devastating criticism of the dominant culture and make it seem like the most racist, evil culture in the world. And that's basically a way of bringing down the culture. They want to impose communism, so they want to destroy the free market, the power structure, so they can impose their communism. So the way to do that is by criticizing endlessly negative criticism of the dominant culture. But anyway, it's kind of cynical. Racism, exists. It's a problem, but they don't really care about ending the problem of racism. They're just using it as a way to, to bring down the present system and impose their own system. Because if they really cared about making society more fair, what they would be doing is trying to improve the education for minority children, making sure that black children got a wonderful education so that they could fairly compete on a level playing field, that they know just as much math and just as much, their English was just as good, and so that they would be able to to hold their own. But actually what the modern left is doing is the opposite of that. They're trying to I guess they sometimes call it like the tyranny of low expectations, but sort of on steroids lately, trying to say that mathematics, there's one right answer, that's white supremacy. So I'm trying to make it so that, like in music, learning how to read music, learning musical notation, that's white supremacy. Anything where you have to learn very specific facts is now considered white supremacy. But they don't really mean it. One of the books I read about the current culture of death, and I'll try to dig up which book it was, but they made the point that the people who are advocating for this very loose idea of words don't have specific meanings, numbers don't have specific meanings, trying to water down education so much that nothing has to mean anything. When it comes to them signing a contract, they would want to get every penny that they're due. They wouldn't buy any kind of argument, oh, the words of this contract don't really mean anything. The numbers that are listed in this contract, they could mean anything. They wouldn't buy that when it comes to their own their own self-interest, but they want to, they're basically trying to dumb down things for the masses, for just the common people, but they don't live by those rules themselves. So.
Well, another thing, the thing is too, like in this era, everything that say if a white person to get their hair styled in a certain fashion, it's called cultural appropriation. If you say this or do that or engage in this, it's called cultural appropriation. I'm going to accuse the Marxists of cultural appropriation. They're trying to import a Western European idea into the rest of the world, where the whole social structure is vastly different. Like China, we made a reference to earlier. China, okay, I used to argue with the people who were the Marxists on campus, and they said, well, it wasn't supposed to take place in China or Russia because they were never gone through the revolutionary period, the Industrial Revolution. They were both agrarian societies largely. And it should have, Marx didn't want it to develop in that. He said it couldn't develop in that because they had a certain level of creation of wealth and also of infrastructure before this kind of take place. So it was a misapplication of taking a tool. If you just want to say they might have some validity, they've misapplied that tool to a situation where it's totally not set up to actually be able to be used. I mean, Soviet, well, we call it Soviet Union, Russia at the time of the 1917, 1918 Bolshevik uprising. Russia was a very, very backward nation, even according to the rest of European standards. It was trying to develop itself to come alongside of the rest of Europe, but it was considered the redheaded stepchild, basically. And it wasn't the princes and the Tsar's family were Germanics. The princesses were the Tsars married a German woman. So Germany, though, actually hadn't fully developed into industrial power at that time yet. It was the 1870s, 1880s when it was developing underneath the Weimar Republic. Not the Weimar Republic, but during the Bismarck's leadership, actually. It was still kind of a developing nation as a unified nation, Germany was. So you had two backward nations where Germany was considered, England and France was considered more pinnacle of the Industrial Revolution at full steam, already developed a large portion, already had the abuses in place. Whereas Germany and Russia didn't have that development yet. China certainly didn't. China was a large portion was underdeveloped. There was, a lot of series where they had invasions from outsiders, and then China's main weapon is they absorbed the invaders. They absorbed them into their population, okay? So China was certainly not on board to be considered the epicenter for a Marxist revolution because they weren't developed to the point that Marx saw England develop. Because he wrote a large portions of his work, well, not in Germany, but in England, because he was exiled in England. So he'd take up months' times at the library there in London. Okay, so that's where he wrote most of Das Kapital, and all the other books he wrote were written in England because he was in exile. And another thing is, too, his wife's family was a fading aristocratic family in Germany. Yeah, so, another thing is, Engels, his collaborator, his father, Frederick Engels' father, was a multinationalist corporation owner. He was the industrialist, a multinational industrialist. He had textile mills both in Germany and in England. So he was basically precedent enough to know that was going to be a problem. But the thing is, the only people who actually become not detached to a body of land or whatever were the international capitalists. They could go, they had the money, the capital to float anywhere they wanted to, land anywhere they wanted to, set up roots and put in roots wherever they wanted to. The workers are basically not much different than the peasants, the era that they're coming out of. So a lot of problems developing. Germany, like I said, just as we're talking, I realized that Germany wasn't even fully economically developed at that point of Karl Marx's writing. So, England and France definitely been more on board for that, and England and the United States. And the United States didn't go full tilt until after the Civil War in the 1860s. 1865, the Civil War ended, and you saw more of a development going on. The South was agrarian. The reason why the North won is because they were able to produce the weapons of war in manufacturing, bases in eastern and northern states.
Right, and the industrialization, all the booming, progress couldn't occur nowadays. Nowadays everything is so regulated, so restricted that, all the big companies we see these days wouldn't have been able to get established because there would be too many regulations in their way. So, all of these, like the Democrats often pretend that they're on the side of the little guy and the small business and the small entrepreneur, as opposed to the big corporations. But all the regulations that we're seeing that the leftists want to impose are only going to help the biggest and like the multinational corporations because they're the ones who can afford to handle all of the kinds of regulations that they're putting in place. Like meanwhile, no one else can compete with them. No one else. Some little startup business wouldn't be able to get established with all the regulations that they have.
Well, look at the regulations they want to add to us now with this Green Deal that he's behind, Biden's behind. Basically, you have to cut production of meat production to the point of where people can only enjoy a hamburger once a month.
Right.
This is absurd. They want us to eat more insect protein. Okay, how are you going to change the mindsets of people overnight like that? My mandate? Let's face it, the Western world typically does not want to eat insects. Okay? I've tried it because it was a novelty. I don't have this revulsion that some people have towards it, but I don't want to wholesalely embrace it either. Is that the only thing I'm going to be eating is like ground up mealworms and crickets?
Right.
This doesn't sound that appetizing. Who's gonna fantasize about going home to a mealworm sandwich? It doesn't have the appeal that a beef sandwich has. Sorry.
Right. Originally, when I heard about the Green New Deal, it sounded extreme to me, but I sort of thought, well, maybe that's sort of some pie in the sky kind of ideal. But of course, they're not really going to impose that on us. That's just too drastic. The things that they would have to do would be, too draconian. But in the wake of all of the lockdowns we've seen, it seems like nothing is too draconian for them. They literally want to impose all of these things on us. It's not just trying to slowly encourage us maybe to eat less meat, which they've probably been doing for years. And I'm actually, as I probably mentioned on the show before, I guess technically it's a pescatarian, which is a vegetarian who eats seafood. And I also eat, dairy, eggs and cheese and milk and all kinds of things. So, I'm not a vegan. But I've when I was younger, I read a book about how animals are treated on these big factory farms, and that made me become a vegetarian. My mom helped me with that. She was very nicely, would cook me a separate meal that was always very appetizing, but often she used fake meat. So I personally eat a lot of the I guess fake meat, or Morningstar Farms is my favorite company that makes it, but and I am still against cruelty to animals, but seeing this done in a very tyrannical way, and they haven't yet done that, but I've watched a lot of videos by this channel, Ice Age Farmer, and I don't remember the name of the guy who runs the channel, but he talks about how they're really moving very quickly now to outlaw animal agriculture, and taking steps to really drive any kind of farmers, who use, the small farmers who you would, if you care about animal right or animal welfare, I guess I would say, rather than animal rights, but if you care about the well-being of animals being used on farms, you would want to encourage the small farms rather than these big factory farms. But their policies are to try to centralize food production, and deliberately drive the small farmers out of business. But then they also are going to want to move the big factory farms. They're going to outlaw the animal agriculture too, and they're going to force us to eat whatever Bill Gates wants us to eat. And I'm not in favor of tyranny, and these people are actually, like I said, they're not really concerned with animal well-being, even though they might use some of the language as if they were. I think one of the rules they're trying to pass is something, I think, like the PAWS Act or the CARES Act, or something supposedly very caring about animal well-being, but that they're not concerned with animal well-being because they in various situations have used supposed pandemics of agricultural disease as an excuse to come and slaughter animals on a mass scale. They'll just come and kill all your chickens or all your pigs or something. So and it's really, the idea is it's the they're supposedly doing it in the name of safety, but they really want to just basically drive animal agriculture out of business so that they can own all the land. And
they want us to be able to kill us off too. If you resist, you force them not to eat, you kill people. They don't give a shit. They don't. I mean, sorry. That's their aim. They want to they'll weaken us with this poor foods and stuff like that. Well, let's face it, our food supply is already bad. Let's face it, we're not getting, even when you eat vegetables, that soil of that land that's grown on is so depleted of nutrients. They dump stuff on it, but it's not the same as allowing it to simply lay fallow for a few years. Let's face it, vegetarians, another thing is I always thought was weird, all these things like out there for like Morningstar Farms, they try to recreate something that looks like meat. Okay, so if you're really on board for why do you have to have it look like? I'm not trying to be mean about it, but it's like
well, it's more appetizing that way, I would say.
I think it's more ingrained in us to see a chunk of meat, and we want to see something that resembles a chunk of meat. I eat Morningstar Farms too and stuff. I mean, I'm not opposed to vegetarian eating. I think eating vegetables, raw, regular vegetables, or cooked vegetables are good. Okay, fine. It's a good part of your diet. Should be, but I have problems with a lot of this nutrition, this Morningstar Farms. I like it. Some of it tastes good, but it's really processed. It's really processed. I mean, when you're getting something that looks like some kind of gelatinous mash and you push it together, you put those dyes on it to make it look like a chicken or a steak sandwich or something. Let's face it, those are chemicals you're putting in there.
Yeah, and then also it seems, well, I didn't watch the video yet, but I think as you can see, I watch a lot of videos, but I think it's the War Room, which is a spin-off of Alex Jones's channel. But I saw the title, but I didn't actually watch the video yet. But it said that someone was saying that the slaves weren't allowed to eat meat, and then the follow-up is that we're not going to be allowed to eat meat either, and it's a way of dehumanizing us.
If you look at cults, typically how they actually control people is keep them sleep deprived, and they also feed them a diet heavy in carbohydrates, not protein, because basically that makes them more susceptible to suggestion, and also they're more lethargic because they're eating carbohydrates instead of a protein source such as meat. And so I remember reading that that's what they did in most places. And if you look at some of the religions that were introduced from other countries, like some forms of Hinduism, they're very, very militantly anti-meat eating, very vegetarian. There was a sect that started up in Washington, the state of Washington, years and years ago, that took over a town. I don't remember.
I think I've heard of it, but I'm not familiar with the details of that.
And the details, if I remember correctly, were they demanded vegetarianism, and they didn't allow them to eat animal proteins and stuff like that. So, and I guess, it could be, you could be a very militant person and still be a vegetarian. I'm not saying that, but the cults usually want to control that's what basically they're forcing us into as American citizens or world citizens. I don't even like using that term.
Yeah, now they want us to all be citizens of the world. They want their one world government, yes.
Yeah, and that's what it is. They want to basically have control of every part of your life, and that's going to definitely have to have the control of your nutritional sources, because if you don't like what you're saying, they're going to deprive you of the right to eat. And that's what it boils down to. I mean, they're not.
And they have a
doing it for
history of
benevolent
it. They can prove that they've done that in Russia.
Time and time again. The left has done this time and time again. So, but anyway, we're coming up to about the hour mark, believe it or not. We've through this hour. We really have. I think we read. But anyway, people get the book or look into the book of The Architects of the Culture of Death. Donald DeMarco, Benjamin Weicker being the editors for that. The one we highlight today was Alan Guttmacher. And the thing I was going to say, too, he was a medical doctor. He was an obstetrician gynecologist, definitely dealing with women's health issues. And he definitely had a lot of a very strong veneer of respectability, I would say, on a surface level. But what he advocated for, I definitely say defies our perceived notions of morality,
Right.
So anyway, maybe we'll pick up another book later on, because we're coming out of... We still got some people we haven't covered in this book, so maybe we'll... But that one person right there we just covered, Guttmacher, I did not ever hear about before getting this book. And I'm glad you chose that selection, because I learned quite a bit. And but this book basically is if you're very anti-Catholic and very pro-choice, this book could probably be an eye roll for you. But I think they have some significant... I think they made some good selections here.
Right, and as we've said, we don't necessarily agree with every word of the book, but it's enlightening and it's eye-opening, as you said, and well-written and well-researched, and it's worth reading.
And that way, so thanks again for coming that distance. She comes all the way from Saline, Michigan.
Saline, yes.
I had the hardest time years ago when we first started with saying that word. I'd see that in my
Well,
head.
saline, I guess, is how you usually pronounce it. But
Well,
that's the word, but the town is Saline, yeah.
Well, see, I'm from Flint here, and then we got a street we call Kersley, but it's Kearsley. Outsiders are going to look, it looks like Tier with a K in front, so it'd be Kearsley. So you could tell immediately when somebody's from an outsider, because it's Kersley, the natives pronounce it, it's Kearsley from the outsiders. So, I mean, I don't know
That's how you differentiate, yeah.
Yeah, and just like there's a street called Crapo. It's Crapo. Anybody else is coming over here is going to look like Crapo. But I think there was a representative or a senator from Utah that was a Crapo, the same name, same family, I think, too.
Right.
They were kind of established family. They were actually Henry Holland Crapo was the grandfather of Billy Crapo Durant, who started General Motors. So locally, they got a lot of significance, maybe out of this area less, but they were a prominent family in the United States because they're pretty wealthy people. They're lumber barons and stuff like that back in the era of lumber was big.
Yeah, I didn't even know that name was associated with General Motors. Of course, everyone knows General Motors, but I hadn't heard of that name before. So.
Well, actually, Billy Crapo Durant, except for locals and some people who studied General Motors history, he's kind of an unknown person. The only thing we actually have, he shares a name of a school. It's Durant Crapo. It's called the Durant Curry Durant, Woodchuck, or no, Durant Terry Mott. Durant Terry Mott is a school over on the west side of the city. But the only thing I know it's significantly his is like a little. I can show you pictures of it later, but it's like between the Whiting and the Sloan Museum. There's a plaza, and that's named after him. But I mean, he like you don't have much mention even it's a town that he put on the map basically. So I mean, it's kind of he died pretty much impoverished. He's buried in some cemetery in the Bronx, New York, for some reason. But that's where he's buried at. But he was a significant player since 1908. I think he started General Motors.
Okay.
So well over 100 years, and I think he died in 1945, 46, 47, something like that.
So to bring it back to Michigan, yeah.
Michigan. But anyway, thanks again for making
Thank
that
you.
distance and coming that distance, and you're dedicated. I tell you that you came up with some bad weather days too.
Today was nice.
Hope you like this program, people. Thanks again.
Thank you.